I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, ashes to ashes, the volcanic eruption in Iceland and the extraordinary cost. Billions were lost as a cloud of volcanic ash shut down European airspace. Now, the lessons to be learnt for airlines and travellers alike. Grounded flights also meant the global supply chain was severed, a case study coming up from Bangladesh. And food security thrown in the spotlight too, just what happens when food stops moving round the world. So welcome to this special edition of Counting the Cost, dedicated entirely to the chaotic events surrounding Iceland's volcanic eruption. So if we didn't know how interconnected our world is, we certainly do now. Not only were people stranded when European airspace got locked down, businesses had to shut down plants, jobs in developing nations went on the line. We were really on the cusp of something quite big and quite damaging to the world economy. So as the planes and the recriminations now fly, we're taking a look at what this will all mean for the airline industry. Just for your own reference, at points in the show, we're going to have a little tag in the corner of your screen so you'll know at what point during the crisis some of our guests were speaking, putting it into some sort of time context. In a moment, John Terrett reminds us of the last time airlines were grounded after 9/11. First, though, Nadeem Barber on this shutdown and whether European authorities overreacted.
Planes on the move around Europe as the airline industry and governments count the cost of a week of flight restrictions. In fact, some say it was safe enough to fly days ago. After one national carrier, British Airways, asked for compensation, some are suggesting the flight ban may have been lifted under pressure.
I am not making any demands to policymakers. I think we should ensure together that this unique incident is being analysed to see how we in Europe, not just in Germany, can ensure that in future the sky is better organised.
Before last week's eruption, the regulations were set out by a United Nations body called the International Civil Aviation Organization. They advised a blanket no-fly policy for any density of ash. Britain's Civil Aviation Authority say nothing could have happened sooner, explaining the major barrier to resuming flights has been understanding tolerance levels of aircraft to ash.
Well, I think they were right to have the ban. It's just playing it safe. The lifting of the ban entirely depends on what they feel is the acceptable level of ash that is there right now in the air corridors. I mean, it is a technical decision in my view. If it is well below the levels that were there earlier on, I think there's no harm in lifting the ban.
Various test flights have allowed airlines to check planes for signs of damage and the scientists to measure how much ash is in the air more precisely.
And we've been able to, with test flights, with all those sorts of scientific methods, together to say it is safe to fly between point A, point B, and to extend that as quickly as possible but as safely as possible.
There's still no single European voice deciding what airspace should be open or shut. That's something the politicians may now be looking at. But for air passengers around the world, the chaos of the last week is something they won't want to see repeated.
The last time US airlines were forced to keep so many jets on the ground instead of in the air making money, the circumstances were far more sinister and the disruption much more widespread. It was the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, 2001. Flights were grounded for 4 or 5 days. When the skies did reopen for business, many Americans were too frightened to fly, so carriers slashed ticket prices to the bone to bring customers back. When the cost of fuel reached record highs later in the decade, many US carriers went into bankruptcy protection to reorganize their debts. With the Iceland ash cloud robbing US carriers of a crucial income stream, business and first-class travelers.
Where you've got perhaps on a 777, 50 business class seats, each one of them selling for between $3,000 and $5,000 round trip. If you lose a week or 10 days worth of that business on your flights, that is a significant amount.
Profits in US airlines have always been spotty at best. Many major carriers wouldn't survive without federal and state assistance.
You want your planes flying 11 or 12 hours a day, and if they're not, you're losing money.
Most analysts agree that long-term consolidation is the path to profitability for many of them. The ash cloud might just bring that about a little sooner than anyone expected.
So on the money side of things, the airline industry reckons it was losing $250 million a day due to the disruption. In total, it lost over $1.7 billion. The individual statistics are interesting too. It gives you a sense of the international scale of all this. Have a look. British Airways puts its losses at $30 million a day. Thai Air lost $3.4 million, and Dubai-based Emirates $10 million, plus it said it spent $1 million a day accommodating its passengers. Let's add another airline into that mix, Qatar Airways. Its CEO, Akbar Al-Bakr, dropped by the studio during the crisis, joined me live on air. This is what he had to say about Qatar's losses.
We are losing around $5.5 million a day of not operating nearly 120 aircraft since last Thursday. And in addition to this, we are also paying around $250 to $300 a day in accommodating our passengers in Doha.
And no airline, be it British Airways, be it Qatar Airways, be it a budget carrier anywhere, can afford to do that. It's as simple as that.
Well, no airline can really afford. I think this is the worst situation the airlines are in since 9/11.
So the airlines have got to find a way to get around this sort of thing. This is exposing an inherent flaw in the industry, the fact that when planes can't fly, everything falls apart. What are you going to do if this happens again, if it carries on?
Well, fortunately, we are in a region that has nearly 80% of our network still accessible by air. So we are flying those routes. We are also directing flights to European airports with extra flights, for example, to Rome, to Milan, to Madrid. Airspace that are still open. And then we do land transportation for our passengers to Frankfurt, to Munich, to Paris, and so on, to Zurich, Geneva.
Do you have contingency plans in place for something like this, though? Because this seems to have, maybe I'm overstating here, but it seems to have caught people by surprise. It happened quickly. Airspace was shut quickly. Suddenly, planes are on the ground everywhere. Do you have contingency plans for this sort of thing?
Well, we have. This is why we have been able to still fly aeroplanes into areas that are closer to the problematic region.
What's the industry going to do in the future, then, to avoid this? You're saying this is the worst thing since 9/11. That's a big statement to make.
You see such kind of incidents don't happen pre-announced. What we can do is just take the best what we can do in situations like that.
What about pressure, if I can use that word, on the European controllers? Because they're the ones who are preventing the airlines from going up. It's as simple as that. They're Lufthansa, KLM, BA, they've all done test flights already. They seem happy.
And we are doing test flights too. But at the same time, you cannot risk the lives of passengers just because of business, because you want to fly and make money. You have to be absolutely sure that every flight that takes off is absolutely safe in the interest of the passengers.
Akbar Al-Bakr, CEO of Qatar Airways, many thanks for joining us. So now we look at the aftermath, the sometimes ugly business of compensation. Just where do we stand in law? Can the airlines claim money from the authorities? Can the passengers peg back their losses? As the crisis began to dissipate, I caught up with a commercial lawyer, Kawa Qureshi QC. We started by talking about the airline's chances of government aid.
The events of September the 11th were truly exceptional and catastrophic in some respects. Of course, the states felt an obligation to assist the airline aviation industry. In this case, if what's being said is that this was a natural event, then the position of the states is going to be that airlines have to accept that when events of this nature happen, they have to bear losses just as everybody else has to.
Let's talk about the people aspect of things, because we've had people stuck all at airports, probably having to shell out for hotels, food, car rental, all these sorts of things. What sort of rights do people have at this point under European law?
Under European law, as a result of recent legal instruments, the position is very simple. If the contract for air transportation is governed by European law, passengers who are subjected to disruption and delay are entitled to claim compensation for the delay and seek reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses such as hotel accommodation and food. The response of some of the airlines has already been that the EU regulations weren't meant to cover events as dramatic as these, not least because the scale and the duration of the event couldn't have been foreseen by those who wanted the regulation to be put through, and the regulation was really intended for delays of a few hours or maybe a day or two, and certainly not for an event of this nature.
Khawar Qureshi, QC there. And in amongst all these guests who joined us live on air, we also had a visit from the world's biggest software maker. You might have heard of it, Microsoft. Craig Mundy was in Doha, Chief Research and Strategy Officer at Microsoft. He wasn't actually stuck in Doha because of the crisis, but he did have some thoughts on how we might have to rethink the way we do business in light of a mammoth air disruption like this.
I think there's been two drivers moving people toward more internet-based communication and collaboration. One has been the general push toward greenness, and people are looking for ways to cut their travel in general. And then, you know, the volcanic effect, you know, really emphasizes for people that there are other ways to get some of these meetings done, and I think it'll help people move there more quickly. Is the idea of teleconferencing, video conferencing a bit too expensive for people to think about? Or is that changing as well? Well, my view is today we have it sort of at two ends of the spectrum. You can buy really expensive suites to do this stuff, and it's very high quality, but quite expensive for the equipment and the communication. And then you got the other end where you can use instant messaging and webcams on your PC and sort of do it at a personal level. What's missing is sort of a medium grade capability in the middle that would really be suitable for businesses everywhere. And that I think you'll see emerge in the next year or two. And keep an eye out, we're going to bring you the rest of that interview next week. Very interesting discussion about what Microsoft is actually developing these days, and also the issue of being cool, or otherwise, in the face of brands like Apple and Google. But when this special edition of Counting the Cost returns, we consider the fallout. Following on from what Craig said, do businesses need to change the way they work? We're going to take you down the road to a supermarket, which was running low on plenty of imported goods, and also all the way to Bangladesh, where jobs are on the line. That and more in a moment. Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop here on Al Jazeera. This week, focusing entirely on Europe's great airspace shutdown. But we do want to take it further than that, because what this shutdown almost did was break the world's supply chain. Consider these numbers. $12.1 trillion worth of goods are exported every year. $12.4 trillion are imported. This means the total value of world trade is $24.5 trillion. 40% of that is transported by air. So that means roughly 9.8, close enough to $10 trillion of trade is at risk if there are, and there were, problems in the air. So that is the math, plain and simple, the kind of math which meant a company like BMW had to stop production of certain cars because it couldn't fly in electronic components. It also meant far more wide-reaching, everyday things, like empty supermarket shelves. Some of the food in our shops has flown thousands of miles, and we're going to discuss the merits of that later. First, Stephanie Decker with this report from one of the biggest supermarket operators here in the Middle East.
A trip to the supermarket to stock up on supplies. Here in Qatar, the shelves are usually stacked with imported goods, French and American cheeses, even Dutch tomatoes. As an expat, whatever your favorites were at home, normally you can find them here.
Yes, and there's a few South African products as well, which is good. Yes, yeah.
But now with the ash from Iceland's volcano, flights from Europe have been delayed, and that means some of the expats' favorites are starting to run out.
We are producing the bread, but people have something like a King's Meal, and they have their own brand image. So that bread we cannot serve.
But no one seems very worried here. The shelves are still pretty full, and if you can't find your favorite brand, some say it's not the end of the world.
Especially in terms of cereals and all, I do feel the lack of it, but quite a lot is here, yeah. I can't complain. I mean, we make do with what we get.
90% of Qatar's food needs are imported. In fact, the entire Gulf region is heavily reliant on imports from other countries.
We don't have anything available local fruits, because most of the fruits coming from outside. I wish we could just find everything here in Qatar available instead of import everything from outside.
The need to import becomes clear when you realize that this city has been built on sand, hard, barren land where almost nothing grows. A traditional Bedouin lifestyle replaced with a fast-growing economy and modern needs. just half an hour's drive outside the capital, and it's evident why this country is so reliant on food imports. Now, the government has recently launched a campaign to become more self-sufficient, but it's a lengthy and incredibly expensive process, which means that they will remain dependent largely on the outside world to feed their populations. Now, despite the recent chaos, Qatar has remained largely unaffected, and that's because of its incredible wealth coming from the gas industry and oil, and also because of their global positioning, which means that if they can't source something from one region, they can simply try and find it somewhere else.
But the fallout from the volcano did threaten other things as well, namely the livelihoods of poorer people around the world. Global supply chains rely on the timely shipments of goods, many of them made in developing nations. One of them, for example, Bangladesh, a major supplier of garments to Europe. Nicholas Huck reports now from the capital, Dhaka.
Habib is increasingly frustrated and is quickly losing patience as he prepares to spend another night in his lorry. He is carrying goods destined for London. He has run out of money and his boss on the phone is telling him to stay and wait until the goods are flown out. But there's no sign of this happening anytime soon.
I still haven't even unloaded. I have been sleeping on the roof of my lorry for far too long. If I don't deliver goods, I won't get paid. This can't continue. Someone, somewhere needs to do something.
Since Europe is closed to air traffic, lorries are queuing up outside Dhaka's international airport, and goods are stacked up in the airport's cargo village. As the hours go by, there are more and more of these boxes that are being piled up here in Dhaka's cargo zone. Inside these boxes are shirts, trousers, and knitwear. Now, 80% of Bangladesh's export is accounted for by the garment sector. And here in the cargo zone, there are more than 350,000 kilograms of goods waiting to be shipped to Europe. According to the Bangladesh Knitwear Export Association, Bangladesh is the second largest exporter of goods to the European continent. The garment industry works on a high turnaround. A slight lag in exports will have terrible financial consequences. The country's economy relies on the yearly $14 billion of revenue that the industry brings. As a massive backlog of garment goods are grounded at Dhaka's international airport, factory owners fear for their business.
There's many of us under now fear that we might have some cancellation from the European buyer. It will be millions of dollars, I think, at the end of the day that somebody has to carry these losses.
Workers are trying in vain to make space for more goods. But with new orders arriving every day, boxes are quickly piling up. And the cargo zone manager is worried that the situation will go out of hand.
It's a chain effect, basically. If the cargo is not moving, the exporters are related, and then the other people behind is affected also. So it's overall airlines, shippers, and economy is affected.
In a country marred by natural disasters, the eruption of a volcano in Iceland has even taken the Bangladeshis by surprise. And if the shipments continue to stall, the country could be facing an economic disaster.
Well, let's discuss some of these issues related to trade, and we saw food security earlier as well, and of the airspace closures. Caroline Boyne's with us, a researcher at the International Policy Network. Caroline, thank you for your time. Does the grounding of flights throughout Europe really bring into question the way we trade? You know, we buy exotic fruits from distant places. Businesses rely on this just-in-time system to get the things they need.
Well, I mean, I think it just goes to show just how important world trade has become, especially for things like fruits and vegetables from developing countries. So indeed, the closing of the airspace has shown, I think, just a glimpse of what could happen if we followed certain environmental calls to stop trade with developing countries. So just to give you an example, in Kenya, Kenyan flour industry has been incurring losses of about $2 million every single day. 3,000 tons of flowers have been left to rot, and thousands of farmers have lost their jobs. And you know, this is an industry which employs directly about 70,000 people, and indirectly 2 million people in Kenya depend on it. So I think that we have to remember just how important trading is to developing countries for jobs and income, but also how important it is for us to get cheaper and better value goods all year round.
Yes, so to that end, then we need to revisit the idea of globalization and actually look more at becoming local producers.
I don't think the buy local argument makes sense. I mean, you can buy things locally if it makes sense to produce them there, and that's what we generally have in more or less free market. But the whole buy local campaign just doesn't stand up when it comes to environmental or economic scrutiny. For example, For example, transport only counts for 10% of the emissions in release in the whole of food production on average in the world. So if you cut transport of produce, you're still going to have significant emissions and even sometimes more. So we've seen the example of Kenya, where producing flowers in Kenya and shipping them to Europe actually produces 6 times as little emissions, CO2 emissions, than producing flowers in Holland.
Okay, so you say flowers there. Let me try another example. Bananas, say. The bananas I eat today that maybe travelled from South Africa. What is the true cost of that? Is there such a thing as a true cost? I mean, we could measure the carbon footprint. That's a cool thing to do these days. But when the likes of me see a final number like that, it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really tell you anything unless you put a monetary value to it, like maybe the airline industry does.
Well, I think one of the problems you've hit upon is that it's extremely difficult to actually measure where carbon emissions are released in not only the production of food, but also in the use of it. So a study in the UK by DEFRA actually showed that the majority of transport emissions that had to do with food production and consumption were actually people driving to the shop and back. So I don't think it's a particularly logical way of looking at it. And I think, once again, we can't underestimate just how important these industries are to developing countries who have a comparative advantage and who are very good at growing crops all year round at a cheaper rates.
Okay, so we've got to support developing nations. That's very clear. To do that, does a body like the European Union in this case need to change? You know, we continue to hear about so-called food mountains, great big stockpiles, the billions of euros paid in subsidies as well to farmers, France being one of the biggest beneficiaries there. So there's got to be a change there.
Okay, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually if people are worried about environmental damages and waste in the agricultural industry worldwide, subsidies are the first place to start. I mean, there's huge amounts of waste and environmental damage due to agricultural subsidies being lavished on already rich farmers in the West. Now, whether there is going to be a fair playing field, unfortunately, it looks very unlikely. I mean, the recent announcement of the European Union was that it was going to revise its common agricultural policy, which is what gives European farmers loads of subsidies, and it was going to revise it and make it more green. Now, so basically, you know, it's protectionism painted in green, which is what you often see is a coalition between protectionist groups like farmers in the West and green organizations who want to buy local. So unfortunately, I don't think the situation's going to change anytime soon. All right, Caroline, thanks very much for that. Caroline Boyne joining us there from London. And that's almost it for this Counting the Cost special. Check us out online, though. This is the main page. You get there from the programmes link at aljazeera.net/English. Weekly entries go up there, past episodes, blogs, broadcast times, all available for you there. Plus, we're on Twitter. You can keep up with what's coming on next week's show. Plus, send us your story suggestions at AJ Counting Cost is the name to look for. But that is it from Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.